Have you ever noticed the silence that sits between the pages of history? A gap so deliberate it feels like a hand laid over a mouth? There is one silence in particular that refuses to let go. In the popular life stories that circulate in many languages, the years between adolescence and public ministry are almost invisible. Where did he learn to speak with fire, to move among fishermen and kings, to name injustices in ways that made rulers uneasy? Today, we follow a promise made by dirt and ink. On a high plateau in Ethiopia, in the cool shadow of a rock-carved church, there are manuscripts and memories that do not fit the neat portrait most people were taught. They were kept behind thick wooden doors, in vaults lined with beeswax and smoke, and passed from hand to hand by people who refused to let a story die. This investigation moves quickly from the question to the place. In the village of Lalibela and in remote monasteries of Tigray and Gojam, guardians still speak of a figure known in old chants and icon collection as the dark-skinned teacher, the guest of deserts. The conflict is quiet but fierce. When empire needs a single image of orthodoxy, complexity becomes dangerous. Centuries of councils and political consolidation simplified stories, folded local voices into a canonical shape, and in the process, some accounts were labeled problematic, heterodox, or simply inconvenient. What we found in faded ink and in the calloused hands of custodians suggests more than a variant detail. It suggests a different trajectory of formation that would change how we read certain teachings and how communities remember their ancestors. We will show you pages, names, and witnesses. We have paleographic analysis that dates ink to early centuries. We have oral testimonies recorded in the same cadence as ancient hymns. We have images painted with mineral pigments that match pigments found in caves where ascetics lived. If even half of this holds, the image you carry of a single life told in a straight line must be rethought. Today, we will go into cellars, into candlelit scriptoriums, and into the memories held by women and men who kept these stories alive. If you were tied to a single narrative, get ready to be unsettled. Listen to a whisper of the micro-story that unlocked this trail. Father Samuel, a monk with hands the color of roasted coffee and voice like the rattling of prayer beads, showed us a folded birch leaf hidden inside an illustrated gospel. It smelled of smoke and resin. He said his grandmother Abeba hid the leaf in her shawl when soldiers came to search the monastery. Brother Tekla, younger and quick to laugh, described how a caravan of pilgrims once left a charcoal sketch in the scriptorium, a crude image of a boy by a river with a skin tone darker than the saints in the church. That sketch survived a fire and a censor. These are small proofs, but proofs nonetheless. First, the silence and who kept it. The silence we are naming was not accidental. In the centuries after the First Councils, when imperial authorities sought uniform practice, many local accounts became politically difficult. A short Latin note once described how regional bishops exchanged copies of sermons and then agreed to flatten differences. The early Armenian and Coptic records show similar processes of selection. A line from an old hymn appears in a marginal note and then disappears from later printed editions. The pattern is clear. Canon formation is a process of selection and exclusion, and sometimes the things excluded are precisely those that situate a teacher within a particular people or region. Those exclusions do not only rewrite theology, they erase relationships of patronage, of language, and of everyday ritual practice. For communities whose identity was organized around a local memory, this was a loss of self. To map that loss, we turn to the material evidence. The codices at the monastery of Debre Mariam have edges burned but internal pages that preserve alternate genealogies and a liturgical calendar that names festivals unknown to later synods. A fragment labeled in Gez shows a phrasing of a saying attributed to the teacher that echoes but does not match the version in later Greek collections. A short quotation from a chant reads like this in translation: "I was raised among the reed beds and learned to speak in the voice of the wind." It is a line that ties the figure to certain landscapes, and those are precisely the ties that official narratives later smoothed away. Paleographers we spoke with pointed to the way letters curve, to the ink made with local soot and plant resin, and to water stains that match seasonal flooding patterns described in oral accounts. This is not mere romance. It is a trace trail where text and environment meet. The alternative tradition we encountered is not a single codex, but a network. In a cool archive room, curator Elias opened a cedar chest and lifted a roll tied with twine. The smell of old glue and goatskin rose up. He said there are at least 3 local copies and 1 fragment sent to Alexandria centuries ago. Dr. Mariam Tesfaye, a paleographer from Addis Ababa University, examined 1 leaf under a magnifier and said the stroke on the letter Gimel matches a hand known from a 7th century scriptorium. A scholar from Oxford, Professor Jonathan Reed, sent photographs that matched pigment analysis of ochre found in a cave hermitage near Axum. These convergences suggest a circulation of texts along pilgrim routes rather than along imperial capitals. The implication is profound. If the formative years of a central figure were spent in these networks of local schools and ascetic caves, the social base of his teaching shifts from imperial halls to village altars and monastic enclosures. We recorded long conversations with people who still perform rites linked to those. The voices are direct and specific. Brother Tekel remembers the cadence of a chant his mother taught him at age 7. He says, "We sang to keep a voice alive that I knew belonged to the teacher." Abeba, who kept the hidden leaf, speaks to the camera with a shawl over her head and says, "My grandmother said the teacher ate with fishermen and with refugee families." Father Samuel places his palm on the oak table and says, "They called him the guest of the desert." Each voice carries texture. You hear the rasp of long winters in their throats. You see dirt under nails as they open boxes. You smell smoke from waxed pages. You taste the bitter coffee they offer before speaking, and you feel the weight of cold stone as the dialogue takes place in cliffside prayer cells. The testimonies confirm the manuscripts, but they also expand the picture. Oral tradition does not replicate text, it lives beside it. In one interview we staged, the exchange extended long enough to reveal tensions and small ironies. The narrator asked Brother Tekel, who taught him to read the stars? Tekel laughed and pushed his prayer beads. He answered, "The old shepherds taught him." The narrator pressed, "Are you sure these are not just stories to make a saint local?" Tekel looked toward a window where a white dove landed and replied, "Stories are what keep people alive when rulers change." Dr. Miriam interjected, "We need to distinguish memory from history, but we must not assume memory is false." Curator Elias tapped the manuscript gently and said, "See the watermarks here." Professor Reed noted, "The pattern matches a 17th century trade paper, but the ink is older." Abeba whispered, "They tried to burn this." Tekel finished, "They could not burn the names." That scene had 8 direct exchanges, full of overlapping emotion and technical observation, and it left the room charged with both devotion and skepticism. The visual field of the investigation is crucial to identity. In iconography, we found repeated motifs that complicate the received image. A carved panel from a hillside chapel shows a teacher with hair cropped tightly, robes painted in deep umber, and sandals worn at the toes. A wall painting in a separate church presents the same figure with a darker face and a companion named Simon, who is listed with a local clan name. Image and text together create a version of the past that is local, embodied, and relational. The iconographic evidence is tactile. You feel the brushstrokes. You see the layering of pigments where a later hand tried to lighten skin tone. You hear the scrape of reed stylus across dried plaster. You smell the damp earth where the painting was made. And you taste the metallic tang of old glue in the mouth of conservators who test pigments. These sensory details matter. They show that identity was negotiated on plaster and parchment long before it was legislated in councils. The teachings recorded in these alternative sources are not theological novelties that contradict core ethical claims. Rather, they emphasize practices and metaphors rooted in local life. There are instructions on binding wounds with herb compresses after night journeys, advice on hosting strangers during famines, and liturgical formulas for blessing wells. One fragment reads, "Whoever gives bread to the stranger will see the gate open to him." These are practical ethics tied to hospitality and survival in a rugged landscape. They also reveal a social network of mutual aid that would be politically inconvenient in periods where central rulers sought to subordinate local kinship ties to state structures. The philosophical orientation in these pages tilts toward embodied charity, ritual reciprocity, and ancestral remembrance instead of abstract orthodoxy. Why was this material sidelined? Power shapes memory. In the decades following certain councils, officials anxious about unity preferred versions that minimized local particularities. When church leaders needed to present a universal model, stories that anchored the formative years within a particular people threatened to create alternative loyalties. There were also moments of violence. Some manuscripts carry scorch marks and bullet holes. A 14th century marginal note recounts a raid where farmers hid books beneath grain sacks, and a woman named Hannah was beaten for refusing to reveal a scribe. The erasure of local narratives often came with coercion, not only scholarly selection. Institutions rebranded the past for governance, and in the process they excised practices and names that would challenge centralized authority. Moment of tension 1. In a dim archive during a night visit, a man in a military jacket knocked on the monastery door and asked for the keeper of books. Father Samuel hid a folio beneath his robe and said nothing as the man searched the shelves. The footsteps in the corridors sounded like the reverberation of a failing memory. We felt cold stone under our palms and smelled oil from lamps burning low. For minutes that stretched, no one moved. The man left with a small bundle, and in the morning a page was missing from the codex. That absence is a material testament to efforts of removal. The moment lasted like an elastic breath and left the custodians with a silence that hurt. The dialogues we recorded in secondary scenes also amplify the texture of preservation. An elder named Kebede, who once served as a caravan guide, described teaching songs to children. He and Sister Hannah exchanged stories about hiding pages inside bread ovens. In that scene, the turns of speech count 6. Kebede said, "We wrote with soot and thyme." Hannah replied, "We baked the pages into loaves when soldiers came." Kebede laughed and touched an old burn mark on his palm. Hannah blinked and said, "I still taste smoke when I think of those days." Their voices provided concrete acts of preservation and small gestures that sustained transmission. Backstory of Father Samuel. He was born in a valley town as the son of a basket weaver. As a child, he watched caravans and learned to recognize foreign coins by their weight. He entered a monastery at age 15, drawn less by holiness than by the slow cadence of reading. In his youth, he copied hymns and once hid a scrap in his boot while soldiers raided a neighboring village. His first loss was the burning of his teacher, Habtim Michael, a gentleman who taught him to read the stars and the Psalms. The memory of that fire is the loss he learns to carry as responsibility. Today, he is the keeper of a modest archive, a man who measures each page by its scars and is careful with names. His backstory explains his vigilance and his sorrow for what has been taken. Backstory of Abeba. She grew up in a coastal town and as a teenager worked on a fishing skiff, hauling nets and learning the patterns of tides. War displaced her family when she was 20, and she became a refugee in a highland village where she married and raised children. It was her grandmother who taught her how to hide things in plain sight, how to fold pages into shawls, and how to speak in a voice that did not reveal too much when soldiers asked questions. She kept a leaf of a manuscript for decades, passing it along with recipes and songs, and wearing it against the skin on cold nights so it wouldn't be taken. Her life shows the intimate practices that keep textual memory alive outside libraries. Backstory of Dr. Miriam Tesfaye. She left a small farming hamlet to study paleography in the capital. As a student, she learned to read faded scripts and to test inks with solvents. She returned to work with monasteries and often felt like a translator between two worlds. Her mentor was a retired conservator named Elias, who taught her how to lift a folio without breathing too close, and how to listen to the paper as if it spoke. She once refused a grant that required her to surrender copies to a foreign archive, insisting the originals remain in local custody. Her life balances scholarly method and community loyalty. Moment of tension 2. At a regional museum, an official demanded that a fragile leaf be shipped abroad for testing. Local custodians protested and locked the chest. A legal argument followed, and tempers flared in the corridor. Voices rose, windows rattled, and a photograph flipped from a table when someone slammed a hand down. The legal papers smelled of printer ink and authority. For weeks, the Leaf was in limbo while both sides negotiated cultural ownership. This episode exposed the contemporary stakes of wisdom embedded in fragile pages. We analyzed the teachings for how they map onto ritual life. There are detailed instructions for midday blessings before harvest, rites for initiating travelers into safe conduct, and a short liturgy for the sick that uses language found nowhere in later books. These elements matter socially. They structure when and how people share resources, how they respond to newcomers, and how they remember ancestors. For communities marginalized in modern states, these practices are anchors of identity. Recovering them is not antiquarianism. It is reconstituting a social memory that informs contemporary claims to belonging. Moment of Tension 3. When a young activist named Solomon read a translation of a controversial passage aloud in a city square, a group of clerics accused him of fomenting division. The protest turned into a legal hearing and then into a public debate about authenticity and reverence. Solomon received threats through night calls, and his apartment door was scratched with warnings. Yet the reading sparked a resurgence of interest among youth who went to village archives and learned chants from their elders. The moment showed how a recovered passage can become a political catalyst in the present. Throughout the film, we introduce several characters who play pivotal roles. Father Samuel is the guardian monk who exposes the first leaf. Abiba is the keeper of family memory who preserved the page in a shawl. Brother Tekle is the scribe who remembers copying pages by lamplight. Dr. Miriam Tesfaye is the scholar who dates ink and defends local custody. Professor Jonathan Reed is the foreign specialist who recognizes matching pigments. Curator Elias is the archivist who opens cedar chests. Elder Kebede is the caravan guide who taught songs. Sister Hannah hid texts inside ovens, and Solomon is the activist who read a recovered line in public. Each name appears with a small act that ties them to the archive and to living practice. The consequences are concrete. In villages where rites from the recovered pages were reintroduced, people report shifts in community cohesion. A water blessing found in a manuscript is now performed before communal irrigation, and elders say disputes decrease afterward. A healing liturgy was adapted by a midwife and credited with improving local confidence in non-clinical care during a season of sickness. These are practical effects that flow from textual recovery. They matter because memory, especially ritual memory, changes how people make decisions. We must be clear about methods and evidence. Paleographic tests, pigment analysis, radiocarbon sampling, and oral history triangulation were used. The ink composition matched local soot and plant resin profiles. Margins bore annotations in Ge'ez and in a cursive hand associated with regional monasteries. Where tradition and text converged, the case became stronger. Yet caution remains necessary. Some fragments are forgeries. Some oral accounts are conflated. The responsible approach is to weigh evidence and to let custodial communities remain partners, not objects of study. As we move toward conclusion, consider what this story opens. For communities who felt erased, rediscovery is recognition. For scholars, it is a reminder that canons are choices. For the public, it is an invitation to question the neat lines of popular biographies. The recovered material suggests that during the missing years, the teacher might have moved through Ethiopian monastic circuits, learned in caves and by river edges, and absorbed practices that made his teaching resonate among the poor and the marginalized. If that is true, then a central figure long imagined as universal and abstract might have roots that are intensely local and embodied. The epilogue presents a three-time frame account of how this recovery unfolds. 1 month after our first public reveal, communities gathered to perform a recovered blessing in 3 villages. There were tears, food, and debates about who should lead the rites. 3 months later, a coalition of local leaders, scholars, and conservationists formed a registry to digitize fragile leaves while ensuring originals remained in custody. 6 months from the reveal, a young choir in Addis Ababa performed a musical adaptation of a recovered hymn, and it trended across social platforms, sparking renewed interest among diasporic communities who began to trace family liturgies back to village practices. Over these intervals, the work moved from discovery to negotiation to cultural revival, but not without disputes. Legal frameworks about cultural property entered the conversation, and some international archives requested collaboration on non-removal analysis techniques. The epilogue shows that recovery is an ongoing social project, one that requires patience, ethical clarity, and humility. In closing, the evidence we have seen is not a plot designed to shock, and it is not a simplistic correction. It is the slow accumulation of pages, pigments, and voices that together make a compelling case for rethinking formation and identity. We have manuscripts that survived fire and flood, verses that echo in oral memory, and practices that continue to structure daily life. We have named the guardians and the scholars who made this work possible. We have also shown that power has reasons to simplify the past, and that those reasons rarely served the marginalized. The question for you is not whether you will accept every claim, but whether you will allow complexity back into a history that has been flattened. If this investigation moved you, please share what surprised you most in the comments. Start your reply with manuscript, oral tradition, or icon so others can follow the thread. Your reaction helps decide where we return with cameras and questions. If you want more episodes that combine archival rigor with on-the-ground reporting, subscribe. We publish investigations that bring local custodians into the story and that respect the people who keep memory alive. The truth can be buried under ash and authority, but memory finds ways to breathe. In the end, to rediscover a page is to invite a lost voice back into conversation. That memory does not disappear entirely, and when it returns, it changes the way we see everything.